Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. The Ouija board gave me directions to a graveyard. My name is on one of the headstones. I've always been a skeptic. You know, the type of person who laughs at ghost stories and thinks Ouija boards are just party tricks. But when a group of friends invited me to join them for a Ouija session on a Friday night, I figured, why not? We were all bored, stuck in a small town with nothing better to do, and this seemed like a harmless way to pass the time. It was at my friend Tim's place, a crumbling old Victorian house that always seemed a little too creaky for comfort. The perfect setting for something like this, though I wasn't taking it seriously at all. We gathered around an old wooden table in the dining room, dimming the lights to set the mood. Tim had pulled out this antique Ouija board that looked like it had seen better days. The letters were faded, and the edges were chipped, like it had been passed down through generations or maybe just tossed around in the attic. We laughed and joked about it, but when we started, something shifted. I can't quite explain it, but the air felt heavier. The usual sounds of the house settling seemed to fade away, leaving only the faint crackle of the fireplace and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath us. Tim asked the first question. Typical stuff like, "Is anyone there?" and "Can you hear us?" The planchette moved slowly at first, like someone was pushing it as a joke. But when Tim pulled his hands off to prove he wasn't messing with us, it kept moving. We stared, wide-eyed and silent, as it spelled out, "Yes." I felt a chill in the room, but I didn't say anything. The atmosphere had shifted, but I still wasn't ready to admit that something weird was happening. It had to be one of my friends messing around, right? "Who are you?" Emily, another friend, asked, her voice a little shaky now. The planchette moved again, gliding more smoothly than before. G-A-T-E. Gate, I said, confused. What does that even mean? Nobody had an answer. We were all starting to get a little uneasy, but the curiosity outweighed the fear. That's how it always starts, doesn't it? Tim leaned forward. "Where is this gate?" The planchette moved faster now. "Graveyard." We all exchanged nervous glances. Tim chuckled nervously. "All right, this is getting a little too spooky." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I mean, sure, the town had a graveyard, but it was small, unremarkable, and we had all been there at least once for some local event. It wasn't a place anyone thought about, let alone a gate to something sinister. That's when Emily, always the daring one, asked, "What happens if we go there?" The planchette paused for a moment, as if whatever spirit we were talking to was considering its answer. Then it moved again, slower this time. "See." "See what?" I muttered, the knot in my stomach tightening. The whole thing felt wrong now, but I didn't want to be the one to chicken out. "You guys want to check it out?" Emily said, already standing up from the table. She always had this reckless curiosity that pulled the rest of us into trouble. Tim laughed, shaking his head. "You're crazy." But the idea had already taken hold. We were going to the graveyard. We grabbed some flashlights, and within 15 minutes, we were walking down the lonely dirt path that led to the old cemetery. The night was unnervingly quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. My heart was pounding, though I kept telling myself that this was just a stupid prank or some random coincidence. Graveyards are creepy enough on their own. We didn't need a Ouija board to make it worse. When we arrived, the place was as empty and eerie as you'd expect. Rows of old, weathered headstones stretched out in front of us, some so worn down you could barely read the names. The moonlight cast long shadows, making the whole place feel even more surreal. I felt a strange pull, like something was guiding me deeper into the cemetery. "All right, we're here. Now what?" Tim said, shining his flashlight around. He was trying to sound brave, but his voice had a slight tremor. None of us had an answer. We just stood there, waiting for something. And then I saw it. A headstone off to the right, slightly hidden behind a cluster of overgrown bushes. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. My legs moved on their own, taking me closer until I was standing right in front of it. It was my name, my full name, carved into the stone. Same birth date too. But the death date, it was blank. I stumbled back, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath me. My friends were still shining their flashlights in other directions, oblivious to what I had found. "Guys," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Come here." They came over, and the second Tim's flashlight hit the stone, everyone froze. Silence fell over us like a heavy blanket. No one said a word, but I could feel the panic setting in. "What the hell, man?" Tim muttered, his face pale. I had no answer. I didn't know what to say or think. All I knew was that we needed to leave, now. "Let's get out of here," I finally managed to say. We left without another word, practically running back to Tim's house. The walk back felt longer, the air colder. But the scariest part wasn't over yet. When I got home that night, I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that headstone, my name staring back at me from the cold, hard stone. I told myself it was a coincidence, just some freak thing that couldn't be real. But then my phone buzzed. I picked it up and froze. It was a text from an unknown number. "Don't go back." That text. "Don't go back." I stared at my phone, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't recognize the number, and there was no name attached. My fingers hovered over the screen, unsure of what to do next. Was this one of my friends messing with me? That seemed likely, but something about the timing. It didn't sit right. I texted Tim. "Hey, you didn't send me something creepy just now, did you?" His response came almost immediately. "What? No. Why?" I didn't want to go into detail yet, so I just said it was nothing and put my phone down, hoping to forget about it. But I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my gut like a stone. There was something about that graveyard, about that headstone, that felt unfinished. But I sure as hell wasn't going back. I tried to sleep, but every sound in my apartment felt amplified, like the pipes groaning in the walls, or the distant hum of traffic was somehow alive, watching me. I tossed and turned, but no matter what, that cold, heavy feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed again. The same number. Not safe. My hand shook as I held the phone, eyes glued to the words on the screen. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck prickling, like someone was behind me watching. But when I whipped around, there was nothing, just the empty, dark room. I typed out a reply, more out of frustration than anything else. "Who is this?" 3 dots appeared, signaling the person was typing. They took their time, each second dragging out like an eternity. When the message finally popped up, I felt my blood run cold. "I'm the one who saw your name first." I dropped the phone, heart pounding, and backed away as if the thing was cursed. That didn't make any sense. Who? Who saw my name? How? There was no way anyone knew about that headstone but me and my friends. I scrambled to my feet, pacing around the room, my mind racing. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just someone pulling an elaborate prank. But what kind of person would go through this much trouble? I checked my doors and windows, double-checking the locks, even though I knew they were all secure. The air felt thick, pressing down on me like the weight of the night itself. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my nerves getting the best of me. But deep down, I knew something was off. And then I heard it. A tapping sound, faint but distinct, coming from the hallway outside my apartment. My heart skipped a beat. I slowly crept over to the door, my pulse in my ears as I peered through the peephole. Nothing. just the empty hallway, lit dimly by a single flickering light bulb. But the tapping continued. I stood frozen, staring, not daring to make a sound. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the walls, the floor, or something else. It was almost rhythmic, like someone tapping their fingers against wood, but slower, more deliberate. I backed away from the door and grabbed my phone again, my hands shaking. I sent a quick text to Tim, not caring how crazy it sounded. Something weird is happening. I keep getting these texts. Someone's messing with me. His response didn't come for a while. When it did, it wasn't the reassurance I was hoping for. Man, I've been getting weird stuff too. We shouldn't have messed with that thing. Great. So now it wasn't just me. Tim was freaked out too. I could feel the panic starting to set in, that cold, creeping dread that something was very, very wrong. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but it felt like we had poked something we shouldn't have. Something that wasn't just going to let us walk away. I tried to keep myself busy for the next few days. I threw myself into work, hung out with friends, anything to keep my mind off the graveyard, the headstone, and that stupid Ouija board. But the texts didn't stop, each one more cryptic than the last. Time is running out. Don't ignore the signs. It knows. I didn't respond to any of them after that. I didn't want to engage. I tried to block the number, but new ones would appear, each with the same pattern, the same unsettling warnings. It was as if someone, or something, was tracking me, watching my every move. One night, about a week later, I got another message. This time, it wasn't a warning. Look outside. I felt a pit form in my stomach. I was sitting in my living room, the only light coming from the TV, the rest of the apartment bathed in shadows. I didn't want to look, but some twisted part of me had to. I crept over to the window, heart hammering in my chest, and pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek through. The street outside was empty. No cars, no people. Just the usual row of dimly lit houses. But then my eyes landed on something that shouldn't have been there. Across the street, standing under the glow of the street lamp, was a figure. A person, tall and motionless, their face obscured by the shadows. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing my apartment. I stumbled back, letting the curtain fall shut. My mind was racing. Who the hell was that? What did they want? Before I could do anything, my phone buzzed again. I nearly dropped it as I looked at the screen. Graveyards aren't just for the dead. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just some prank. This wasn't just some random text chain or a coincidence. Someone, or something, was after me. And it all started with that stupid Ouija board. Tim texted me later that night. He sounded frantic, more scared than I'd ever heard him before. We need to talk. Something happened. When Tim texted me that he needed to talk, I could feel the tension tightening around me like a noose. Something had clearly spooked him, and after everything that had been happening with the texts and the figure outside my window, I wasn't about to brush it off. I told him to meet me at my apartment. I didn't want to be alone anymore, and besides, I needed answers. Answers I wasn't sure I could get from just staring at my phone. He showed up about half an hour later, his face pale, his eyes wide like he hadn't slept in days. The second I opened the door, I knew something had shaken him to his core. He didn't even bother with small talk, just shoved his way inside, glancing around like he expected someone, or something, to be lurking in the shadows. "We shouldn't have messed with that board, man," he blurted out as soon as the door closed behind him. His voice was strained, like he was holding something back. "I think we woke something up." I didn't want to believe it, but everything inside me was screaming that he was right. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel it wavering. Tim ran a hand through his hair, pacing around the living room. "I've been seeing things," he whispered. "Weird things. Shadows in my room that move when I'm not looking. I keep hearing footsteps, but when I check, no one's there. It's like..." It's like something is watching me, all the time. My stomach twisted. "Have you gotten any texts?" I asked, feeling a knot form in my throat. He nodded. "Yeah, same number as you, right? But it's not just texts anymore." I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the window. "I've been hearing a voice. It calls my name, in my own house, like it's standing right behind me. But when I turn around, there's nothing there." I didn't know what to say. Everything he was describing mirrored what I had been feeling. The oppressive sense of being watched, the strange sounds in the middle of the night. But a voice? That was something new, and the idea that it could escalate like that terrified me. We sat in silence for a while, both of us too shaken to speak. I couldn't help but replay the events of that night at the graveyard in my head. That headstone with my name on it. The text that followed. The figure outside my window. It felt like we had set something in motion, something we couldn't stop. Finally, I broke the silence. "I think we need to go back," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I could fully process them. Tim looked at me like I had lost my mind. "What? Go back? Are you insane?" I wasn't sure why I said it, but deep down, I knew we wouldn't get any peace until we faced whatever was haunting us. The graveyard was the start of it all. Maybe it would also be the end. "We need to figure out what this thing wants," I continued. "Maybe there's something there, something we missed." Tim was shaking his head, but I could tell he was considering it. He knew as well as I did that ignoring this wasn't going to make it go away. After what felt like an eternity, he sighed. "Fine, but we go during the day. No way in hell am I going back there at night." I agreed, and we made plans to return the next afternoon. I barely slept that night. Every little creak or groan of the building sent me into a state of hyper-alertness. I didn't even bother trying to close my eyes after the first few hours of restless tossing and turning. The fear had wormed its way into my bones. When the sun finally rose, I felt a small sense of relief. Daylight had a way of making everything seem less threatening, like the shadows couldn't reach you when the sky was blue. I convinced myself that the graveyard wouldn't be nearly as terrifying in the light of day. I was wrong. We arrived at the cemetery just after noon. The air was crisp, but there was something off about the place. Despite the clear skies and warm sun, the graveyard felt colder, as if the sunlight didn't quite reach it. The trees around the edges seemed darker, the grass less vibrant, as if the land itself was holding its breath. "Let's just get this over with," Tim muttered, walking ahead of me toward the cluster of headstones where we had been the other night. I followed, trying to keep my breathing steady. The headstone with my name on it was exactly where we had left it, partially obscured by those same overgrown bushes. But as we approached, something was different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but then I saw it. There was a fresh wreath of flowers laid at the base of the stone. Tim froze, his face going pale. What the hell? I knelt down, my heart racing, and gingerly touched the flowers. They were real, fresh even. But no one had been here. The graveyard was completely empty when we arrived. "Who did this?" Tim whispered, his voice trembling. "Who the hell put these here?" I shook my head, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "I don't know." As we stood there, the air around us seemed to thicken. The silence became oppressive, and I started to feel that same sense of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking among the graves, but there was no one. And then I heard it. A soft, rustling sound, like footsteps moving through the grass. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. I exchanged a nervous glance with Tim, who had clearly heard it too. "Let's go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This was a mistake. I wanted to agree, but something stopped me. I felt that same pull from the other night, like an invisible force was keeping me rooted in place. My eyes were drawn back to the headstone, to the blank space where the death date should have been. That's when I noticed something else. The stone wasn't as clean as it had been before. There was something etched faintly beneath my name, so subtle I had missed it the first time. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat as I realized what it said. Today. The word was barely visible, but it was there, carved into the stone in the same style as my name. My blood turned to ice, and I stumbled back, my mind racing. "What's wrong?" Tim asked, his voice laced with panic. I didn't have time to answer, because at that moment, the soft rustling sound returned, louder this time, and this time it wasn't coming from the bushes. It was coming from beneath the ground. That sound, that awful rustling, wasn't from the wind. It wasn't from animals or from anything I could rationalize. It was coming from beneath our feet, under the earth itself. I locked eyes with Tim, and for a second, I thought he might pass out. His face had gone white, his breathing shallow and rapid, and I could tell that he was barely holding it together. "We need to go," he muttered, backing away from the headstone. But I couldn't move. My legs felt like they had been cemented to the ground. The sound beneath us grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a rustle anymore. It was scratching, scraping, like someone, or something, was trying to claw its way to the surface. The graveyard that had been silent moments before now felt alive with movement. I looked down at the ground, and that's when I saw it. The earth was shifting. The dirt around the base of my headstone had started to crumble, small clumps falling away, like something underneath was pushing it up. "Get away from there!" Tim's voice cracked with fear, and he grabbed my arm, yanking me back. I stumbled, breaking my gaze from the headstone, but my mind was spinning. What was under there? What was trying to get out? And then I heard it, a voice, faint but clear, as if carried on the wind, but there was no mistaking the words. "Come closer." My breath hitched in my throat. It wasn't just some random voice, it was my voice. I froze, my heart racing as I strained to listen. The words repeated, a little louder this time, like it was calling me specifically. "Come closer." Tim was still pulling me away, panic in his eyes, but I couldn't shake the sound of that voice. It was so familiar, like it was an echo of my own thoughts, my own fears. I knew, without a doubt, that it was coming from beneath the headstone, from the grave with my name on it. "What the hell is that?" Tim's voice was barely a whisper, his grip on my arm tightening as he dragged me further from the stone. "We need to leave. Now." I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to get the hell out of there, to never look back, but I couldn't stop thinking about that voice. My voice. How was that even possible? How could something beneath the ground be calling me like that? And then the ground shifted again. This time, it wasn't just a faint tremor. The dirt around the headstone split open, a jagged crack running through the earth like a wound. Something dark and wet seeped through the gap, pooling around the edges of the grave. I couldn't tell what it was in the dim light, but the stench hit me almost instantly. Decay, rot, like something had been dead far too long. Tim gagged, covering his nose and backing away even faster. "Jesus, we need to get out of here!" But I couldn't look away. My eyes were glued to the crack in the earth, to the blackened liquid seeping out from underneath. And then I saw it. Movement. Something was writhing just below the surface, pushing against the earth like it was trying to break free. And then the voice came again, louder now, more insistent. It wasn't just asking me to come closer anymore. It was commanding it. "Look." The command sent a chill through my entire body. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was beneath the ground, but it was like I had no choice. My feet started moving on their own, dragging me back toward the headstone, even as my mind screamed at me to stop. Tim was yelling something, but his words were drowned out by the sound. The scraping, the scratching, the deep rumble of the earth itself shifting and groaning. The crack in the ground widened, and I saw it. A hand, a pale, shriveled hand, pushing its way through the dirt. Its fingers were long and bony, covered in the same blackened sludge that was pooling around the grave. But the worst part? The ring on its finger. It was mine. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of twisted nightmare. There was no way I was looking at my own hand, clawing its way out of a grave that bore my name. The hand twitched, as if it was testing the air, and then slowly, methodically, it gripped the edge of the crack and began pulling itself further out. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was frozen in place, watching as something that should not have existed dragged itself into the light. It was me. Not exactly, but close enough. The thing that crawled out of the ground had my face, my eyes, my mouth, even my clothes, though they were tattered and stained with that black sludge. But it was wrong, twisted. The skin was stretched too tight over the bones, the eyes sunken and hollow, the teeth too sharp. It looked like a decayed version of myself, something that had been rotting beneath the earth for far too long. And it was smiling. "Look," it said again, its voice rasping, barely human. It reached out a hand toward me, that same twisted grin plastered across its face. "You don't belong here. I do." I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, finally finding my voice. What are you?" The thing, my doppelganger, tilted its head, still smiling. "I'm what's left. What's waiting. You were supposed to stay away." Tim was shouting at me, grabbing my arm again, trying to pull me away, but I couldn't tear my eyes from the thing in front of me. It was me, but it wasn't. It was like looking into a mirror that showed the worst version of myself, the version that had been buried in the ground, forgotten, rotting. "Don't come back," it rasped, its voice barely a whisper now. "Next time, you won't leave." I didn't need to be told twice. Tim yanked me away, and this time, I didn't resist. We ran. We ran like our lives depended on it, sprinting through the rows of headstones, back toward the gate, back toward safety. But even as we fled, I could still hear it. That voice, my voice, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the graveyard as we left it behind. "Next time, you won't leave." We didn't stop running until we were halfway back to my apartment, breathless and drenched in sweat. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. Tim collapsed onto a nearby bench, gasping for air, his face pale and drawn. My mind was racing, spinning with everything that had just happened. But I couldn't get that final image out of my head. Myself crawling out of the grave, twisted and decayed, whispering those words like a curse. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The night air felt colder now, like the graveyard's chill had followed us all the way back into town. My hands were still trembling, and my chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I glanced at Tim, who was staring at the ground, his eyes wide and unfocused. He hadn't said a word since we'd left the cemetery, and I could tell he was just as rattled as I was. "I'm done," he finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We never should have gone back there, man. We should have left it alone." He was right. I knew he was. But there was one thing still gnawing at the back of my mind. Something I hadn't been able to shake since we'd left the graveyard. That thing, that version of me, it had said I didn't belong, that I was supposed to stay away. But away from what? The graveyard, the headstone, or was there something deeper, something we hadn't fully uncovered? I wanted to push it out of my mind, to forget the whole thing and move on. But that voice, the one that had whispered to me from the ground, kept echoing in my head, like it was calling me back. It had told me not to return, but there was a part of me that couldn't resist the pull, the need to understand what had happened. I looked down at my phone, half expecting another message, another warning, but the screen was blank. No unknown numbers, no cryptic texts, Just silence. "Do you think it's over?" Tim asked, his voice cracking slightly. I didn't answer right away. I wanted to believe that leaving the graveyard had ended it, that whatever we had stirred up was satisfied with scaring us out of our wits. But deep down, I knew better. That thing in the grave, the version of myself that had crawled out of the ground, it hadn't just been a warning. It had been a promise. Something had been set in motion. Something that couldn't be undone. "I don't know," I finally said, my voice barely audible. Tim didn't press further. We sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of what had happened pressing down on us like a suffocating blanket. Neither of us knew what to do next, and that was the worst part. There was no handbook for dealing with something like this. No way to reverse whatever curse or twisted fate we had triggered. After a long, tense pause, Tim stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I'm going home," he said quietly. "I don't want to think about this anymore." I nodded. "Yeah, probably for the best." He gave me a half-hearted wave before heading off, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying the weight of the world. I watched him go, a sinking feeling in my gut that this wasn't the last time we'd be dealing with whatever we had unleashed. When I got back to my apartment, I locked every door and window, pulled the curtains tight, and tried to force myself to relax. But sleep didn't come easy. Every creak, every groan of the building made my skin crawl. My mind was stuck on the cemetery, the headstone, and the version of myself that had crawled out of the earth. It had looked at me with such familiarity, such certainty, like it knew something I didn't. And those final words, "Next time you won't leave," felt like a shadow looming over me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I woke up to the soft buzz of my phone. My heart jumped into my throat as I reached for it, half expecting another cryptic message. But it was just a text from Tim. "Can't sleep. I keep thinking about it. Are you okay?" I texted back. "Barely. What about you?" "I keep hearing things," he replied. "In my house. Like whispers. They're saying my name." I stared at his message, a wave of dread washing over me. It was happening again. The same whispers he had heard before, the same voice that had called to me from the graveyard. It wasn't done with us. Before I could reply, another text came through, but this one wasn't from Tim. "You didn't listen." My blood ran cold. It was the same unknown number, the one that had warned me to stay away. My hands shook as I typed out a reply. "What do you want?" The response was immediate. "You were supposed to stay gone. Now it's coming for you." I swallowed hard, the room feeling suddenly too small, too dark. I tried to think of what to say, how to stop this, but my mind was blank. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to leave us alone. It had made its intentions clear. It wanted us, and it wouldn't stop until it had us. I was about to text him again when my phone buzzed one more time. "Don't look outside." My heart stopped. I didn't want to. God, I didn't want to, but the pull was too strong. My hands moved on their own as I slowly walked to the window, my pulse thudding in my ears. I hesitated, fingers trembling as I reached for the curtain. Every part of me was screaming not to look, not to give in, but I couldn't help myself. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek through. Standing under the street lamp, staring up at my window with that same twisted grin, was me. The Ouija board connected us to a dark web user. He knew things about us that we never told anyone. I've never been one to believe in Ouija boards. They always seemed like a party trick, a way to spook your friends when you're bored. That changed about a month ago. My two best friends, Maya and Chris, convinced me to try it out one night after a few drinks. We were hanging out at Maya's place, just the usual lazy Saturday, and for some reason, Chris thought it'd be fun to contact the dead like we were in a low-budget horror movie. At first, I laughed it off. "Really? You believe in that stuff?" I asked, rolling my eyes. But Maya was already pulling a Ouija board out of her closet. It was the classic wooden one, with faded letters and a worn-out planchette. The thing looked ancient. "You'll see," Chris said, grinning. "It'll be fun. Let's ask some dumb questions and see what happens." "Fine, but don't blame me when you're both freaked out and I'm the one driving you home," I joked. We set the board up on the coffee table, and the three of us sat in a circle. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the kitchen down the hall. Maya lit a candle for ambiance, because why not make it more cliché, right? We placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, and Chris, being the most dramatic of us, started off. "Is anyone here with us?" he asked in his best spooky voice. Nothing happened for a good minute. We all exchanged glances, trying to suppress our giggles. I could tell Maya was ready to call it quits, but then the planchette moved. I swore none of us were pushing it, but it slid slowly to yes. "Okay, which one of you is messing around?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. Maya looked just as shocked as I felt, and Chris raised his hands like he was innocent. "I'm serious, I'm not doing anything," he said, looking genuinely confused. "Yeah, sure," I muttered, but then the planchette moved again, this time spelling out something. M-R-C-H. "March," Maya asked. "What does that mean?" Now I was starting to feel uneasy. None of us were born in March, and we didn't know anyone with that name. The room felt different, colder somehow, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. But we kept going. "Who are you?" Chris asked, trying to sound brave. The planchette spelled out another word. I-S-E-E-Y-O-U. We all froze. "Okay, this is getting weird," I said, pulling my hands away from the board. "Let's stop, this isn't funny." But Maya wasn't ready to quit. "Wait, maybe it's just a random spirit or something. Let's ask it something else." I didn't like the idea, but I didn't want to be the one to ruin the game either. So we placed our fingers back on the planchette, and Maya asked, "What do you mean you see us?" The answer came faster this time. I-K-N-O-W-Y-O-U. A heavy silence filled the room. This wasn't fun anymore. It felt too real, too targeted. I could see the tension in Chris's face, and Maya's hand was starting to shake. "How do you know us?" Chris asked, his voice quieter now. The board spelled out something that made my stomach drop. D-A-O-K-U-E-B. "What the hell?" I whispered. "This isn't normal." We all looked at each other, suddenly aware that something was very wrong. We hadn't talked about the dark web at all. None of us were into that kind of stuff. I mean, I'd heard stories, but they were just that, stories. No one actually went there, right? But whoever, or whatever, we were talking to seemed to know more than we wanted to admit. Chris's face went pale. "Guys, let's stop. I don't like this." Before we could pull away, the planchette moved again, this time faster and more erratic. W-A-T-C-H-I-N-G. I pulled my hands away immediately. "That's enough. This isn't a joke anymore." But as I stood up, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't think anything of it at first, but when I checked the screen, my blood ran cold. It was a message from an unknown number. The text simply said, "I see you." I stared at the message, my mind racing. There was no way this was a coincidence. My first thought was that Chris or Maya were pranking me, but the fear in their eyes told me they were just as confused and scared as I was. Maya checked her phone next, and her face turned white. I got the same message," she whispered, holding up her phone. Chris grabbed his phone and cursed under his breath. Me too. We all sat there in stunned silence, not knowing what to do. This wasn't some random ghost or a made-up story anymore. Someone, or something, had connected with us, and they knew too much. They were watching. "Should we call the cops?" Maya asked, her voice trembling. "And say what?" That we played with a Ouija board, and now someone from the dark web is texting us. Chris shook his head. They'll think we're insane. I didn't have a better idea. All I knew was that this wasn't over. Whatever we'd contacted, it wasn't done with us yet. As we sat in that dimly lit room, phones in our hands, the air thick with tension, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just opened a door we couldn't close. We weren't alone anymore. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. After we shut down the Ouija board and decided to stop playing, there was this heavy, oppressive feeling hanging in the air, like the walls themselves were closing in on us. Maya and Chris stayed at my place because none of us felt safe being alone. We tried to brush it off, tell ourselves that it was just a dumb prank or coincidence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I woke up with that same unsettling feeling gnawing at me. I checked my phone out of habit, half expecting another creepy message, but there was nothing. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over, that whatever we'd messed with had just been a one-time thing. But when I glanced out the window, I froze. Parked across the street from my apartment was a black van. Now, I know how paranoid that sounds, but it wasn't just the van that freaked me out. It was the fact that it hadn't been there the night before. And worse, there was someone sitting inside. I couldn't see their face, just the shadow of a figure behind the tinted windows, but they were definitely watching my place. "Hey Maya," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Come here for a sec." She wandered over, still half asleep, but when she saw the van, her eyes widened. "What the hell?" "Exactly," I muttered. "That wasn't there last night." Chris, hearing the tension in our voices, joined us. "What's going on?" I pointed out the window. "Do you recognize that van?" He shook his head. "No, why?" "Because it's been there since this morning, and I don't know who's inside, but they're watching us." The three of us stared out the window for what felt like hours, none of us knowing what to do. We couldn't call the cops, not without looking like lunatics. "Hey officer, we played with a Ouija board and now there's a creepy van outside." Yeah, that would go over well. Just when we thought things couldn't get worse, my phone buzzed. This time I didn't hesitate. I unlocked the screen, dreading what I might see. It was another text from that same unknown number. "I warned you. Now you're in too deep." I showed it to Maya and Chris, and their faces mirrored the panic I was feeling. Before we could process it, Maya's phone chimed, then Chris's. We all checked our screens at the same time, and my heart sank. Maya's message read, "You can't hide from me." Chris's read, "I know where you are." This wasn't a prank. This wasn't just some random hacker messing with us. Whoever, or whatever, was behind this knew exactly where we were, what we were doing, and they weren't stopping anytime soon. "We need to get out of here," Chris said, pacing the room. "We need to leave now." "Where are we even going to go?" Maya asked, her voice shaky. "Whoever this is, they already know everything about us." I was about to suggest going to a hotel or something when there was a knock at the door. We all froze. 3 loud knocks, deliberate and slow. I exchanged a look with Chris and Maya, and for a second, none of us moved. My heart was pounding in my chest so hard I thought it might burst. "Don't answer it," Chris whispered. "Whatever you do, don't answer." The knocking came again, this time louder. I could feel the blood draining from my face. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to hide, but I felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot. Suddenly, my phone buzzed again. Another text. "Open the door." That's when I really lost it. I backed away from the door, nearly tripping over the coffee table. What do we do? What the hell do we do? Chris was already on his phone, dialing a number. "I'm calling the cops. I don't care if they think we're crazy. I'm not dealing with this." The knocking stopped abruptly. Silence filled the room, but it was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. We stood there, holding our breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. 911, what's your emergency? I heard the operator ask on the other end of Chris's call. Before Chris could respond, a loud crash came from the window. We all jumped, spinning around just in time to see the glass crack, spiderwebbing outward like it had been hit with something hard. I grabbed Maya and pulled her back from the window. "Get away from there!" I shouted, panic rising in my throat. The van across the street revved its engine, and before we could even think, it sped off down the road, tires screeching. The sound of the engine roaring away echoed in the silence, and we stood there, staring at the cracked window, trying to catch our breath. Chris spoke into his phone, his voice trembling. "Someone just tried to break into our apartment. We need help." The police came not long after, but of course, there wasn't much they could do. No one had broken in, technically, and the only lead they had was the description of the van, which could have been anyone's. They took our statements, gave us the usual "stay safe" speech, and left us more confused and terrified than ever. That night, none of us slept again. We sat in the living room, keeping the lights on, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. No more knocks, no more texts, just an uneasy silence. I thought maybe we were in the clear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. I knew that whoever had reached out to us through that Ouija board wasn't done yet. They were playing a game, and we were the pawns. And then, just before dawn, when I was finally drifting off to sleep on the couch, my phone buzzed one more time. My heart nearly stopped as I read the message. "You can't run forever." The message hung in the air like a noose tightening around my neck. "You can't run forever." I showed it to Maya and Chris, and their faces told me everything I needed to know. They were just as scared as I was. We were spiraling into something far more sinister than we'd ever imagined, and every second that passed made it harder to see a way out. For the next few days, we tried to go back to some kind of normalcy. Maya returned to her apartment, and Chris went back to his place, but we kept in constant contact, always checking in, always on edge. We tried to convince ourselves that maybe, just maybe, it was all over. No more messages, no more strange knocks at the door. But there was still the van. The black van that seemed to appear at random times, always parked in different places near our apartments, as if whoever was inside wanted us to know they were still watching, but didn't want to get too close. I stopped leaving my apartment unless I had to. Grocery store runs became military operations, quick in and out, constantly scanning the parking lot for any sign of that van. But one evening, after I returned home from picking up a few things, I noticed something odd the moment I walked through the door. My apartment felt wrong. Everything looked normal at first glance. The furniture was in the same place. Nothing had been stolen. But there was this unsettling feeling that someone had been there. I walked through each room cautiously, checking closets, behind the shower curtain, anywhere someone could hide. My heart was racing, but I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. Then I reached my bedroom. The closet door, which I always kept closed, was open just a crack. I didn't remember leaving it that way. I took a deep breath and walked over to it, gripping the handle and yanking the door open in one quick motion. Nothing. No one was inside. I let out a nervous laugh, shaking my head at how stupid I was being. But then, as I turned to leave, I noticed something on my bed. A single piece of paper, folded neatly, resting on my pillow. My blood ran cold. I hadn't left that there. I hadn't had anyone over. I was alone. With trembling hands, I unfolded the paper. Written in neat, almost delicate handwriting, was a single sentence. "I know your secret." My breath caught in my throat. What secret? I didn't have any deep, dark secrets, at least none that I thought could be used against me. But this wasn't some random prank. Whoever this was, they'd been inside my apartment, waiting, watching, and they were toying with me now. I called Maya and Chris immediately. "Someone was in my apartment," I said, pacing my living room. trying to keep my voice steady. "They left a note. They know something." Chris swore under his breath. "Did you call the cops? And tell them what? That someone broke in without breaking anything and left me a creepy note? They'll think I'm losing it." Maya, always the calm one, tried to keep us grounded. "Okay, this is getting out of hand. Whoever this is, they've got us all on edge, but we can't let them win. Let's meet up tomorrow. We'll figure this out." I agreed, even though my gut told me things were going to get worse before they got better. That night, sleep didn't come. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside felt like it was being orchestrated to keep me awake. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, even when the lights were off. I kept imagining the van outside, the shadowy figure inside it, always waiting. But worse, I kept thinking about the note. "I know your secret." I didn't have any secrets, did I? When morning finally came, I was beyond exhausted, but I needed answers. I met Maya and Chris at a diner, where we talked in hushed voices like conspirators. We were all paranoid now, glancing at every person who walked past our booth like they might be part of this nightmare. Chris tapped the table nervously. "We have to consider that this might have something to do with the dark web. Whoever we contacted through the Ouija board could be from there." "But how?" Maya asked, sounding skeptical. "It was a game, just a stupid board game. How could it connect us to someone on the dark web?" I shrugged, my mind racing. "I don't know, but whoever they are, they know things about us, things they shouldn't know." Just as we were discussing our options, Chris's phone buzzed. He looked down at it, his face going pale. He showed us the screen, and we all leaned in to read the message. "I see you." My stomach twisted into knots. It was happening again. Chris's phone buzzed again, and then mine, and then Maya's. We all received the same message, one after another. "I see you." Maya stood up, her hands trembling. "We need to get out of here, now." But before we could even leave, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Across the street, parked just out of sight, was the black van. It was almost hidden behind a row of parked cars, but I knew it was there. The driver was watching us. "We're being followed," I whispered. "They're here." Chris looked out the window, spotting the van. His expression hardened. "We're not running anymore. We're going to face this." But before we could do anything, my phone buzzed one more time. This message wasn't like the others. It wasn't vague or threatening. It was a photo of the three of us, sitting in the diner booth just moments ago. The angle was perfect, as if it had been taken from across the street, from inside the van. My heart sank, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt truly helpless. Whoever was behind this wasn't just watching us from a distance anymore. They were right here, right now, and they were letting us know that we couldn't escape. The note, the van, the messages, it all pointed to one thing. We were being hunted. And the worst part, we had no idea why. We left the diner without a word, moving in silence like prey, trying not to draw the attention of a predator. The tension was suffocating. Maya's face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. Chris had his jaw clenched, his eyes darting between the van and every shadowy corner we passed. I could feel the fear radiating from all of us, but none of us wanted to admit how terrified we really were. The van didn't follow us when we left, but that didn't make me feel any better. It was like whoever was behind all this knew exactly when to pull back, just to keep us guessing, keep us on edge. I didn't want to say it out loud, but I was sure we were being herded, pushed into a corner with nowhere to go. We ended up back at my apartment, locking the door behind us and pulling the curtains shut. The silence inside was oppressive, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. I could see Maya fighting to keep her composure, her breathing uneven as she sat on the edge of the couch, staring down at her phone as if it might give her some kind of answer. Chris paced the room, agitated. We need to figure out what this person wants. They've been playing with us for days. They've been in our homes, following us, watching us. Why? I shook my head. I don't know. But I'm starting to think this has less to do with the Ouija board and more to do with us. Whoever this is, they know things, personal things. The board was just a way to get our attention. Maya spoke up, her voice small. Do you think this has something to do with the dark web? Maybe we connected with someone dangerous without realizing it. I didn't want to admit it, but it made sense. We'd all heard stories about the dark web, about people being stalked, targeted, or worse. But those stories always felt distant, like urban legends. Now, though, we were living it. Chris stopped pacing and pulled out his phone. I'm going to check something. Maybe there's a way we can trace these messages, figure out where they're coming from. As he tapped away at his phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something. The messages, the van, the note in my apartment, they were all connected. But how? What did this person want from us? And then, as if to answer my unspoken question, my phone buzzed. I hesitated for a moment before checking the screen. Another message from that unknown number. I know your secrets, and now you're going to pay for them. My stomach churned. What secrets? What could this person possibly know? I didn't have any dark past, no skeletons in the closet, but whoever they were, they wanted me to believe I did. They wanted us to feel vulnerable, exposed. Chris's phone buzzed next, then Maya's. We all exchanged glances before looking at our screens. Each message was the same. Confess or suffer the consequences. What the hell does that mean? Chris growled, slamming his phone onto the coffee table. Confess what? Maya's hands were shaking as she looked at her phone, her face drained of all colour. I don't know, but I don't want to find out what the consequences are. I felt trapped. No matter what we did, no matter how much we tried to protect ourselves, this person was always one step ahead. They knew things they shouldn't know, and they were toying with us, pushing us closer to the edge. And then there was the sound, a soft, scratching noise. At first I thought it was coming from outside, like branches brushing against the window, but as it grew louder, I realized it was coming from inside the apartment. Chris heard it too, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the front door. What is that? The sound grew more insistent, like nails scraping across wood. Maya stood up, her eyes wide with panic. It's coming from the hallway. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my hands slick with sweat. My heart was racing, pounding in my chest like a drumbeat of fear. Chris grabbed a chair, holding it up like he was ready to swing at anything that moved. Together, we edged toward the hallway, the sound getting louder with every step. We reached the door, and the noise stopped. Complete silence. For a second, I thought maybe we'd imagined it. Maybe the fear had gotten to us, making us hear things that weren't really there. But then, the knocking started. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the other side of the door. Maya backed up, her hands over her mouth, trying to stifle a scream. Chris and I stood frozen, staring at the door as if it might burst open at any second. The knocking continued, steady and unrelenting, each one sending a fresh wave of terror through my body. I didn't want to answer it. I didn't want to know who or what was on the other side. Then my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look at it, but I had to. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it, but when I finally unlocked the screen, the message made my heart stop. Let me in. I stared at the message, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But it was. And whoever was behind that door knew exactly what they were doing. Chris glanced at me, his voice barely a whisper. What do we do? Before I could answer, the door handle started to turn, slowly, deliberately, like someone was testing it. I backed up, gripping the knife tighter, my pulse racing in my ears. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The knocking, the scratching, the turning of the handle. It all just ceased. For a moment, none of us moved. We waited, holding our breath, expecting something, anything to happen. But there was only silence. I took a cautious step forward, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe they're gone. Before I could finish the thought, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then they went out completely, plunging the apartment into darkness. We were trapped in the pitch black, with only the sound of our shallow breathing to remind us that we weren't alone. Somewhere, just beyond the door, something was waiting for us. And then my phone buzzed one more time. I unlocked the screen with trembling fingers, and my heart sank as I read the message. I'm already inside. My hands went numb as I read the message. I'm already inside. The words seemed to pulse on the screen, like they had a life of their own. My entire body froze. The lights were still out, the apartment shrouded in darkness, and all I could hear was the shallow breathing of Maya and Chris beside me. I can't do this, Maya whispered, her voice trembling. She was on the verge of breaking down. I could feel it, the way her fear was building, feeding into the claustrophobic tension pressing down on all of us. Chris was gripping the chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. We need to get out of here. We're sitting ducks. Get out to where? I hissed. They know everything. They're watching us. If they're really inside, we have nowhere to go. Just then, the temperature in the room dropped. It wasn't my imagination. I could feel the cold creeping in, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. Something was wrong. More than just the messages, more than just the fear. There was a presence. A heavy, suffocating presence that made it hard to breathe. I took a step toward the door, knife still clutched in my hand. And that's when I saw it. Or rather, I didn't see it. The shadow. It should have been there, cast by the dim light spilling in from the street outside. But there was no shadow on the floor in front of the door, no silhouette to match the shape of the door frame. The hallway beyond was completely still, but I knew, deep down, that something was in here with us. Then Maya screamed. I spun around, nearly dropping the knife. She was staring at the far corner of the room, her eyes wide with terror, her hand pointing towards something I couldn't see at first. My breath caught in my throat as I followed her gaze. There, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. It was standing in the corner, its outline faint but unmistakable. A tall, hunched figure, draped in shadows, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't make out its face, but I didn't need to. The air around it was thick with malevolence, a darkness that seemed to seep into the room itself. Chris backed up, his voice shaking. What the hell is that? The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching us, its presence filling the room with a suffocating dread. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in, and my pulse was hammering in my ears. Then the figure moved. It wasn't a natural movement. It was like it glided across the room, closing the distance between us without making a sound. I stumbled back, raising the knife defensively, but I knew it wouldn't help. Whatever this was, it wasn't something I could fight off with a blade. Maya was crying now, backing into a corner as Chris tried to pull her toward the door. "We need to get out of here," he shouted, but his voice cracked with fear. Before we could make a move, the figure was right in front of me. I could feel the cold radiating off it, an icy chill that made my skin prickle. It loomed over me, and for a brief moment, I saw its face, or what was left of it. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its skin was stretched tight over its skull, like it had been drained of all life. Its mouth opened slowly, revealing a row of jagged teeth, but no sound came out. It was like it was trying to speak, but the words were trapped, buried deep in the void it had crawled out of. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "What do you want from us?" The figure tilted its head again, its mouth still open in that horrible, silent scream. Then, In a voice that sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere, I heard the words, "Confess." I froze. Confess. That word again. But what did it want me to confess? What secret did it think I was hiding? "I don't have any secrets," I shouted, the panic rising in my chest. "I don't know what you want from me." The figure moved closer, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. "Confess, or suffer." I could feel the darkness closing in, pressing against my chest, squeezing the air out of my lungs. I was suffocating under the weight of whatever this thing was. But then, just as I thought I might black out, Maya's voice cut through the darkness. I'm sorry," she cried, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry, okay? It's my fault. I went on the dark web. I found this chat room. It was a game at first, but then I got curious. I shouldn't have..." The figure turned toward her, its gaze shifting, and for the first time, I saw something in its eyes. Understanding, recognition. The temperature in the room seemed to rise a few degrees as the figure drifted toward her. "Maya," I breathed. "What did you do?" She was sobbing now, her hands covering her face. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to see what it was like. I didn't know it would get this far. I talked to someone who knew things. About us. About everything. And then the messages started. I thought I could ignore them, but they wouldn't stop." Chris looked at her, stunned. "You did this?" "I didn't know this would happen," she wailed. "I thought it was just some random guy messing with me. I didn't know he would come after us. I didn't know..." The figure hovered over her now, its hollow eyes fixed on her trembling form. Slowly, it raised a hand, reaching out to her. I wanted to do something, to stop it, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, the figure disappeared. Just like that, the oppressive weight lifted. The room seemed to exhale, the air returning to normal. Maya was still crying, but the shadowy figure was gone. The darkness that had wrapped itself around us evaporated, leaving only silence in its wake. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to feel. We stood there, the three of us, caught between relief and horror. Maya wiped her eyes, her voice small and broken. Is it over?" Chris shook his head slowly. "I don't know." We didn't stay at the apartment after that. We packed a few things and left, not knowing where we'd go, but knowing we couldn't stay. The messages stopped. The van didn't return. For a while, it felt like maybe we were safe. But every now and then, when I'm alone in my apartment late at night, I hear it. The scratching at the door, the faint whisper of a presence just beyond the shadows. And I wonder if it's really over, or if it's just waiting for us to make another mistake. The Ouija board told us to bury it. Now I can hear it, scratching from the ground. This all started as a joke. Isn't that how most horror stories begin? A few friends, a dumb idea, and someone who says, "What's the worst that could happen?" It was a Friday night. We weren't doing anything special, just the usual hanging out at Brian's house. His parents were out of town, and as cliché as it sounds, there's always that one friend with the empty house that somehow makes everything feel more possible. Brian's place was that house. We had pizza, watched a couple of movies, and when we started running out of things to do, someone, probably Jake, suggested we try something fun. And by fun, he meant messing with the Ouija board. Now, don't get me wrong, I've always been a skeptic. I mean, it's a piece of cardboard with letters on it, right? What could it possibly do? The thing had been sitting in Brian's basement for who knows how long, probably untouched since his older sister bought it years ago. It still had dust on the edges when Brian pulled it out from under the couch. The mood shifted when the board hit the table. Everyone tried to laugh it off, but there was this weird tension in the air. You know how sometimes you feel like the room just gets colder, Not literally, but the vibe shifts. That's what it felt like. But none of us were going to admit we were even a little freaked out, so we sat down and went through the motions. Jake, Brian, me, and Carly, all sitting in a circle, our fingers barely touching the planchette. At first, nothing happened. We asked dumb questions like, "Is anyone there? And are we talking to a ghost?" It was all a joke. Carly was snickering under her breath, and Jake kept trying to make his voice sound spooky, like he was narrating some B-movie. But then it moved. I swear, none of us were pushing it. The planchette just shifted, slow at first, spelling out random letters. We thought it was a fluke, maybe someone messing with the board to get a rise out of us. But when we asked, "What do you want?" it spelled out BURYME. The laughter stopped. Carly's smile faded, and I could see Brian's hand twitch, like he wanted to pull away, but didn't want to look scared in front of the rest of us. None of us knew what to say, so Jake broke the silence with a nervous chuckle. "Okay, this is getting creepy." I tried to brush it off too. "Probably someone trying to mess with us," I said, though I wasn't so sure anymore. We asked the board another question, and again, it spelled the same thing, BURYME. Brian, who had been quiet for most of it, suddenly spoke up. "Let's just stop. This isn't fun anymore." But Jake, being the daredevil of the group, pushed back. "No way, man. We've come this far. What if it's trying to tell us something?" That's when Carly did something that still gives me chills to think about. She blurted out, "Maybe we should bury it." There was this heavy silence. It wasn't just a suggestion. It felt like an idea planted in her head. Carly's not the kind of person to get superstitious, but something about the way she said it was unsettling. Jake, always the one to escalate things, said, "Why not? It's what the board wants, right?" Before any of us could talk ourselves out of it, we were outside in Brian's backyard, digging a hole. The night air was damp, and the only light we had was from the weak glow of our phones. None of us spoke much after that. It was like we all just wanted to get it over with. We buried the Ouija board in the shallow grave and covered it with dirt. I remember thinking how ridiculous the whole thing was. Who buries a Ouija board? But there was this weird sense of relief once we were done, like we'd just gotten rid of something we shouldn't have messed with in the first place. We went back inside, tried to laugh it off again, but the vibe was completely off. Carly left early, claiming she had a headache. Jake was unusually quiet, staring at the spot in the backyard through the window like he was waiting for something to happen. Brian tried to act like everything was fine, but I could tell he was spooked too. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the faint sound of scratching, like something scraping against wood. I told myself it was just my imagination, but it was hard to ignore. The next day, I went back to Brian's to pick up the jacket I'd forgotten. When I got there, I found him standing outside, staring at the ground where we'd buried the board. His face was pale, and he didn't look up when I approached. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I frowned. "Hear what?" He gestured to the ground. "Scratching. It's coming from down there." I thought he was messing with me, but the look in his eyes, it wasn't a joke. I knelt down and pressed my ear to the dirt, and for a second, just a second, I swore I could hear it too. This faint, almost desperate sound of something clawing at the earth, trying to get out. That was when I knew. We hadn't buried the board. We'd buried something else. The days after we buried the board were weird. It's hard to explain, but things didn't feel normal anymore. It's not like we all sat down and talked about it. No one wanted to be the one to bring it up. But we all knew something had changed. Brian stopped hanging out as much. Every time I'd call or text, he'd give some excuse about being busy or having too much homework. Jake, who normally couldn't shut up, suddenly became distant too. He didn't joke around as much, and when he did, it felt forced. The only one who seemed completely off the radar was Carly. She wasn't answering any of our texts or calls at all. It was one night, about a week later, when I realized something was seriously wrong. I'd been avoiding Brian's house, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching me, even in broad daylight. But that night, my phone lit up with a message from him. "Come over. I need to show you something." I didn't want to go. Every instinct in my body was telling me to stay away, but I couldn't just leave him hanging. So I grabbed my jacket and headed over, trying to convince myself it would be fine. When I got there, Brian was waiting for me outside. He looked like hell, pale, with dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't say a word, just nodded for me to follow him into the backyard. As we walked, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The grass near where we'd buried the board was starting to die. It wasn't a huge patch, just a small circle, but the dirt was sunken in, like something had shifted underneath. Brian knelt down by the spot and dug a little with his hands. I wanted to tell him to stop, to just leave it alone, but I was frozen, watching as his fingers clawed at the dirt. He only dug about an inch before stopping, and when he looked up at me, I saw real fear in his eyes. He didn't say anything, but I knew what he was thinking. He didn't need to, because there were scratch marks in the dirt, deep, jagged grooves, like something had been trying to crawl its way out. The soil was packed tightly, but the marks were unmistakable. It wasn't the kind of thing an animal could have done. And the worst part? It looked fresh. "We have to get rid of it," Brian finally said, his voice shaking. "How?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. We were going to have to dig it up. We couldn't just leave it buried there, not after what we'd seen. That night, we waited until the sun went down. Jake showed up, looking just as messed up as Brian, and I couldn't even get a hold of Carly. We figured she was avoiding us on purpose by now. It felt wrong to do this without her, but we had no choice. We grabbed some shovels from Brian's garage and started digging. The dirt was heavier than I remembered, like it didn't want to move. The deeper we dug, the more we found those same scratch marks, crisscrossing through the soil, getting closer and closer to where we'd buried the board. Finally, after what felt like hours, the shovel hit something hard. Brian knelt down and brushed away the dirt with his hands, revealing the Ouija board. It was still intact, but something was different about it. The edges looked worn, almost rotted, and the letters were smeared like they'd been scratched at. But that wasn't the worst part. The planchette was gone. We all stared at the board, too scared to say anything. I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, that maybe an animal had somehow messed with it. But then Jake said, "Do you hear that?" At first, I thought it was my imagination again. But as we stood there in the cold, silent night, I could hear it too. That faint, almost rhythmic scratching sound. Except this time, it wasn't coming from the ground. It was coming from underneath the house. Brian was the first to move, slowly walking towards the side of his house, where a small crawl space led under the foundation. I wanted to grab him, stop him from going any further, but my legs wouldn't work. I could barely breathe, let alone speak. He crouched down, shining his phone's flashlight into the dark space beneath his house. His face went pale. He didn't say a word, just stood up and backed away, his eyes wide with terror. "I'm not going down there," he muttered. Jake, on the other hand, was always the one who had to push things further. He grabbed a flashlight and crawled into the space without a second thought. I could hear him moving around under there, muttering to himself about how it was probably just rats or something stupid. But then, everything went quiet. "Jake," I called out, stepping closer to the crawl space. No answer. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Brian and I exchanged a look, and I could see that he was about to lose it. He was shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps, like he was on the verge of panic. Then, out of nowhere, Jake screamed. It was the kind of scream you hear in horror movies, the kind that makes your blood run cold because you know something is horribly, horribly wrong. I could hear him scrambling, trying to crawl out as fast as he could, and when he finally emerged, He was covered in dirt and shaking like a leaf. "There's something under there," he gasped, clutching his chest as if he couldn't breathe. I saw it. I swear to God there's something moving down there." He didn't have to say more. Brian and I didn't need any more convincing. We grabbed him and ran, not even bothering to cover the hole we'd dug. The three of us left the backyard in a panic, but the worst part was, as we sprinted back to the house, I could still hear it. The scratching. Louder this time, like it was getting closer. I haven't been back to Brian's house since that night. None of us talk about it. We've all just been pretending it didn't happen, but deep down, I know it's not over. Because last night, I woke up to that sound again. But this time, it was coming from my walls. The scratching wasn't something I could ignore anymore. Once it found its way into my house, I knew whatever we'd disturbed was far from done with us. I spent the night lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was just in my head. But the noise, it was there. Faint at first, like a whisper. You know how sometimes you hear something so quietly, you almost have to focus on it to make sure it's real? That's what it was like. Except the more I listened, the louder it got. At one point, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and pressed my ear against the wall. The scratching was clearer now, like it was coming from just behind the drywall, something trapped and clawing to get out. My heart raced, my skin cold with the kind of fear that makes every hair on your body stand up. I tried to tell myself it was rats or something logical. I mean, old houses have weird noises, right? But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. This wasn't the sound of little feet scurrying around. It was deliberate. It was slow, rhythmic, like whatever was making the noise wanted me to hear it. I couldn't stay in my room anymore. I grabbed my jacket, slipped on my shoes, and headed outside. The air was cold, biting, but it was better than being inside with that thing. I wandered around my neighborhood, hoping the fresh air would clear my head, but all it did was give me time to think. Time to remember what happened at Brian's. I thought about calling Brian or Jake, but I knew they wouldn't want to talk about it. Not after what we saw, what we heard. They were probably just as freaked out as I was, maybe even worse. Hell, Brian had been the one to hear the scratching first, and now it had followed me home. After about an hour, I ended up at a 24-hour diner down the street. It was nearly empty, except for a couple of tired-looking people sipping coffee in the back. I ordered a cup of coffee and sat in a booth by the window, staring out into the empty street, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching me. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. There was a man standing across the street, right under a flickering street lamp. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. The shadows made it hard to see his face, but I could tell something was off about him. His posture was rigid, unnatural, like he didn't belong there. I looked away, took a deep breath, and tried to convince myself it was nothing. Just some random guy out late at night, right? But when I glanced back, he was still there, in the exact same spot, not moving an inch. And that's when I realized he wasn't just standing there. He was facing my house. I don't know what it was, but something about the way he stood, completely still in the cold night air, sent a chill down my spine. I quickly paid for my coffee and rushed out of the diner, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't even look back as I headed home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. When I finally made it back to my place, the scratching had stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise. It felt like the house was waiting for something. I locked the door behind me and made my way to the living room, every creak of the floorboards sounding louder than it should in the stillness. I tried to distract myself, turning on the TV, but the background noise did nothing to calm me down. My thoughts kept drifting back to that man under the street lamp. Who was he? Why had he been standing there like that? And most importantly, why had he been staring in the direction of my house? Hours passed, and eventually, exhaustion overtook me. I passed out on the couch, too tired to care about the scratching or the weird man outside. But sleep didn't bring any relief. I woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the house. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but as I sat up, the sound became more distinct. Someone, or something, was walking around in my house. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a lamp, and slowly crept towards the hallway, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps stopped as soon as I stepped out of the living room. Silence. But it wasn't the comforting kind of silence. It was heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. I moved down the hallway, every step feeling like it could be my last. When I reached my bedroom door, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see something moving inside. Just a shadow, faint but unmistakable. I pushed the door open slowly, my hand trembling on the knob. The room was empty, nothing out of place, no sign of anyone having been there. But then I saw it. On the wall, near the floor, were scratch marks. Deep, jagged lines carved into the plaster, like something had been trying to get in. Or worse, trying to get out. That's when I realized this wasn't just about the board anymore. Whatever we had disturbed, whatever we had set loose, it wasn't confined to one place. It was following us. And now, it had found me. I backed out of the room, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do next. But before I could even think about leaving, I heard it again. That same scratching noise, only this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside the house, from underneath the floorboards. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, listening to the sound of something clawing its way through the foundation of my home. But one thing became clear. We hadn't just disturbed something when we buried the board. We had awakened it. I didn't sleep at all after that night. How could I? The scratching was everywhere, beneath the floorboards, behind the walls, creeping closer with every passing hour. I tried to stay calm, tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew. We had let something out, and it wasn't going to leave until it got what it wanted. The next morning, I called Brian. He picked up after a few rings, sounding as drained as I felt. "We need to talk," I said, my voice shaking. "About the board." There was silence on the other end, and for a moment I thought he might hang up. But then he sighed. "I know. Something's happening here too. The scratching. It's inside the house now." Hearing him say it confirmed everything. It wasn't just me. Whatever this thing was, it was targeting all of us. "We need to figure out what it wants," I said, pacing around my living room. "Maybe we didn't bury it right. Maybe we..." "Carly's missing," Brian interrupted, his voice barely a whisper. I froze. "What?" "I've been trying to reach her since we dug up the board, but she's not answering. Her parents called me this morning asking if I'd seen her. No one knows where she is." My mind raced. Carly had been the one to suggest burying the board in the first place. What if... No, I couldn't even finish that thought. But the silence on Brian's end told me he was thinking the same thing. The thing we'd unleashed was getting stronger, and now it had Carly. "Meet me at the house," Brian said finally. "We need to finish this." When I arrived at Brian's house, it felt different. There was an oppressive weight in the air, like the house itself was suffocating. The dead patch of grass where we'd buried the board had spread, creeping outwards in an unnatural circle. The ground looked sick, like something was festering beneath the surface. Jake was already there, leaning against his car, his face pale and gaunt. He didn't say anything as I approached, just nodded grimly. We both knew what we had to do. There was no turning back now. We made our way to the backyard, shovels in hand, not even bothering to talk. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost unbearable. Brian was already there, standing over the patch of dead grass, staring at the ground, like he could see straight through to whatever was lurking beneath. "We're digging it up again," he said without looking at us. "This time, we're burning it. No more playing around." I didn't argue. We started digging, the dirt heavy and damp. Every shovelful felt like it was fighting back, resisting us. I could feel the weight of whatever was down there, pushing against the earth, trying to stay hidden. It didn't take long before we hit the board. Only this time, it wasn't the same. The wood was splintered and cracked, like something had clawed at it from the inside. But that wasn't the worst part. The planchette had reappeared, sitting on top of the board like it had never been gone. But it was covered in dirt and something else. Something dark and wet, like it had been dragged through the earth itself. I wanted to get rid of it, throw it in the fire we'd built at the edge of the yard. But something stopped me. It wasn't the fear of touching it. No, this was something deeper. Like the board didn't want to leave. It wanted to stay, to keep its hold on us. Jake was the first to break the silence. "We need to do this now," he said, his voice trembling, "before it gets any worse." Brian nodded, but his hands were shaking as he reached down to pick up the board. The second his fingers touched it, everything changed. The air around us grew cold, colder than I've ever felt, and the wind picked up out of nowhere, howling through the trees like something was screaming. And then we heard it, the scratching. But it wasn't coming from the board. It was coming from beneath us. I stumbled back, dropping my shovel as the sound grew louder, more frantic. The ground started to tremble, small cracks forming in the earth around us. It was like something was trying to break free, clawing its way up from below. "We need to burn it!" Jake shouted, panic in his voice. He grabbed the board from Brian and ran toward the fire, but before he could throw it in, the ground beneath him erupted. It happened so fast. 1 second, Jake was standing there, and the next, he was gone, swallowed by the earth. The ground opened up like a mouth, pulling him under with a force I can't even describe. There was no scream, no sound, just silence. Brian and I stood there, frozen, unable to process what had just happened. The ground where Jake had been standing was now a gaping hole, dark and bottomless. And from inside that hole, we could hear it. The scratching, louder than ever, like 100 claws raking against the dirt. "We have to burn it," Brian shouted, snapping me out of my daze. I grabbed the board from where it had fallen, my hands trembling as I ran toward the fire. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stop, to run, to leave this cursed thing behind, but I knew there was no escape, not anymore. As I reached the fire, I hesitated for just a second. That's when I felt it, something cold, like fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I spun around, but no one was there, just the wind and the hole and the scratching. I threw the board into the flames. For a moment, nothing happened. The wood crackled and burned like normal, and I thought maybe, just maybe, we'd done it. Maybe this nightmare was finally over. But then, the fire turned black. I don't know how else to describe it. The flames twisted and writhed, turning darker than any fire I've ever seen. And from within the fire, I could see shapes, shadows, figures moving through the darkness, clawing at the air like they were trapped in there with the board. The scratching stopped. The hole in the ground closed up, sealing itself as if nothing had ever happened. But the fire didn't go out. It kept burning, the shadows inside growing more frantic, more desperate, until finally, they were gone. We stood there in stunned silence, watching the last embers die out. It was over. Or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. We didn't say a word as we watched the last of the flames flicker out. The darkness around us felt thick, like it was pressing down on everything, smothering the air. The fire was gone, but the silence that followed wasn't comforting. It felt wrong, like the calm after a storm that you know isn't really over. Brian was the first to move. He stepped closer to where the board had burned, kicking at the ashes with his boot. They crumbled into dust, nothing left but a few charred splinters. "It's done," he muttered, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Neither did I. We should have left right then, gone back to our normal lives, and tried to forget any of this had ever happened. But the moment Jake was swallowed by the earth, I knew there was no going back. There was a part of me that hoped destroying the board would put an end to it, that the fire would burn away whatever was haunting us. But deep down, I knew better. Jake was gone. Carly was missing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were next. As we stood there, the air seemed to shift again. It wasn't cold like before, but heavy, like something was watching us. I could feel it, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the kind that makes you want to turn around, even though you know you won't see anything. Brian must have felt it too, because he turned to me, his face pale. "Let's go inside," he said quietly. "We'll figure out what to do next." The house felt different when we stepped back in. The walls seemed closer, the shadows longer. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump, and I could see Brian flinch with each sound. Neither of us said it, but we were both thinking the same thing. We weren't alone. We sat in the living room, barely able to look at each other. I tried to convince myself that we were safe now, that the worst was over. But something was gnawing at me, this feeling that whatever we'd done hadn't just disturbed something, it had invited it in. Suddenly, Brian's phone buzzed on the coffee table. The sound made both of us jump, our nerves on edge. He grabbed it, frowning as he looked at the screen. "It's from Carly," he said, his voice low. I felt my stomach drop. Carly hadn't answered her phone in days. How could she be texting now? "What does it say?" I asked, already dreading the answer. Brian's face went pale as he read the message aloud. "Come to the backyard." My heart started pounding. I looked at Brian, trying to see if he was messing with me, but the look on his face told me this wasn't a joke. "We can't," I started, but before I could finish, Brian was already on his feet, heading for the door. "Wait," I called after him, my voice shaky. "What if it's not her?" He paused, his hand on the doorknob. "I have to know," he whispered, almost to himself. I didn't want to follow him. Every part of me was screaming to stay inside, to lock the door and wait until morning, but there was no way I was letting him go out there alone. So, I grabbed my jacket and followed him into the dark. The backyard was quiet, unnervingly so. The fire pit where we'd burned the board was nothing but ash now, the shadows around it thick and impenetrable. Brian scanned the yard, his phone light cutting through the darkness. "Carly!" he called out, his voice cracking. Nothing, just silence. We walked toward the spot where we'd buried the board, the grass still dead and brown. The earth looked undisturbed, but as we got closer, I noticed something. The dirt wasn't as packed down as it had been. It looked softer, like it had been dug up and filled back in. Brian noticed it too. He knelt down, brushing his fingers through the soil. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. Before I could say anything, the ground beneath us shifted. It wasn't a huge movement, just a slight tremor, like the earth was breathing. My heart stopped. We both stepped back, our eyes locked on the patch of dead grass. The ground moved again, more violently this time. And then, the scratching started. It was louder than before, more frantic. The same sound that had haunted me in my walls, but now it was right in front of us, right beneath our feet. "What do we do?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Brian didn't answer. He was staring at the ground, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. I could see the panic setting in, the realization that we hadn't stopped anything. We'd only made it worse. Suddenly, the ground cracked open. I stumbled back, my heart racing as a long, thin hand reached out from the dirt. It was skeletal, the skin stretched tight over the bones, blackened and covered in dirt. It clawed at the air, pulling itself free from the earth. Brian screamed, stumbling backwards as the hand was followed by an arm, then another. It wasn't just one figure. There were several, all clawing their way out of the ground, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes with broken strings. They were coming from the spot where we'd buried the board. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I could do was watch in horror as these figures, these things, emerged from the earth, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles, their eyes empty, dark voids. Brian snapped out of it first. "Run!" he screamed, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the house. We sprinted for the back door, the sound of the scratching growing louder, more desperate, as the figures dragged themselves closer. I didn't look back. I couldn't. We slammed the door behind us, locking it and barricading it with whatever we could find. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't hold. The scratching was inside now. It always had been. The next few hours were a blur. Brian and I sat in the living room, barely breathing, waiting for the inevitable. The scratching never stopped. It moved through the walls, under the floorboards, like it was surrounding us, closing in. By the time the sun came up, the house was silent again, but I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over. We had tried to bury it. We had tried to burn it. But some things can't be destroyed. They can only wait. And the scratching? It's still there, waiting for us to make the next move.